The sound of violent banging echoed through Sophia's apartment. Each thud reverberated through the walls, her ex, Anthony, relentlessly demanding entry. Her heart pounded, a surge of icy terror crawling up her spine as the haunting memories of their broken past flooded her thoughts. The years of manipulation, the bruises she never spoke of, the fear that ruled every waking moment, it all came rushing back. "I know you're in there, Sophia. Open the door." His voice was raw with anger, every word a threat. Sophia froze, paralyzed by the weight of it. The restraining order sat uselessly in the kitchen, too far to reach without walking past the door. This was it. Anthony was here, and the fear she had fought to escape had returned, stronger than ever. She could call the police, but she knew the drill. It wouldn't be the first time. She had tried that before, but Anthony always found a way. The dread of it, the helplessness. It was crushing, but then, from the corner of the room, came a voice that shattered the panic around her. "Stay where you are." Sophia turned, her breath catching. Angelo Giovanni, a Mafia boss who ruled with an iron fist, sat casually on her couch, his cold, measured gaze fixed on the door as if the chaos outside was nothing more than background noise. Unfazed, unbothered. The powerful, intimidating presence of this man filled the room with a strange sense of calm, as if the world could fall apart, but he wouldn't move an inch. The pounding continued, but Angelo didn't flinch. Instead, he stood slowly, his movements smooth and deliberate. "I'll handle this," he said quietly, his voice deep, unwavering. Sophia's fear clashed with the unexpected comfort his presence brought. As Anthony's rage filled the space, Angelo remained calm, effortlessly taking control of the situation. Sophia realized, in that moment, her life was about to change. The man who had made her shrink in fear was no longer in charge. And this Godfather, who sat unbothered amidst the storm, would show her what true power, real protection, looked like. The sudden, deafening bang on the door sent a jolt of panic through Sophia's entire body. She gripped the edge of the couch, her fingers digging into the soft fabric as her pulse quickened. Anthony, her ex. She had hoped he would just disappear, fade into the background like a nightmare that only haunted her sleep, but here he was again, bringing the darkness with him. The sound of his fists pounding against the door shook her, rattling the very core of the place she had worked so hard to make her sanctuary. The restraining order she'd fought so hard to get now seemed as useless as the paper it was printed on. She stood still, her breath shallow, her mind racing. What was she supposed to do? Her legs felt heavy, as though the floor had turned to cement beneath her. Fear wrapped its icy fingers around her chest, squeezing tight, reminding her of all the times he had manipulated her into submission, all the times he had made her feel small, worthless, all the ways he had broken her, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but fear. And now, here he was again, pounding at her door like a freight train, demanding answers. His voice, jagged with rage, cut through the air. "I know you're in there. Sophia, open the door." The words scraped against her skin like glass. Her body trembled, frozen in place, too scared to move. It was a trap she had been in too many times before. He had a way of making her feel like she owed him, that his anger was somehow her fault. But she knew better now. She had left him. She was free, or at least she had thought she was. She turned her head toward the couch, where her phone lay just out of reach. She could call the police. She could run to the kitchen and lock herself in, but that would mean walking past the door. She couldn't do that. He was too close, too loud, too dangerous. But before the panic could overtake her completely, she heard a low voice from behind her, calm, unwavering. "Stay where you are." The words washed over her like a wave of warmth, pushing back the chill of fear that had taken over. Sophia's breath hitched as she turned to see Angelo Giovanni sitting on her couch, as if nothing was amiss. He looked at her, his gaze cool and steady, unshaken by the chaos. He was a mountain of calm, an immovable force that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, this time she wouldn't have to face this alone. Angelo didn't flinch as another violent thud echoed from the door. He didn't look worried or panicked. He didn't even seem angry. He simply rose from the couch, his every movement slow and deliberate, like he had done this countless times before. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. He just stood, as if his presence alone was enough to change everything. "I'll handle this," he said, his voice smooth and commanding, the kind of tone that didn't need to be raised to make its point. He crossed the room with measured steps, and with a quiet motion, he unlocked the door. The moment it swung open, Anthony froze, his face twisted in disbelief as Angelo stood before him, blocking the doorway with a solid, unyielding presence. The storm outside, the fury in Anthony's eyes, didn't even faze Angelo. He simply stared, unblinking, waiting for the next move. Sophia's heart pounded, but this time it wasn't from fear. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of something else. Hope. Angelo stood tall in the doorway, his presence like a wall, blocking out the fury of the man outside. His expression remained unreadable, calm as a still sea, while Anthony's rage sputtered into confusion. The door creaked slightly on its hinges, but Angelo didn't flinch, didn't even glance at it. His gaze was fixed on the man in front of him, whose wild eyes flashed with panic as he tried to regain control of the situation. Sophia's breath caught in her throat as she watched. She had never seen anyone stand so unyieldingly before. She had spent years tiptoeing around Anthony's moods, afraid to provoke him, always fearing the consequences of making him angry. But now, as she stood in the background watching Angelo, a strange sense of peace settled over her. He wasn't afraid of Anthony. In fact, it seemed as though he was the one in control now. "You don't belong here," Angelo said, his voice low but firm. It wasn't a threat, it was a simple fact. He didn't raise his voice, nor did he need to. The authority in his words was enough to cut through the chaos, drawing a sharp line between the tension outside and the safety inside. Sophia felt the knot of fear in her stomach loosen just slightly, but her body was still tense, still shaken from the attack. Her eyes flicked between Angelo and Anthony, unsure of what would happen next, but knowing, somehow, that Angelo would handle this. She had always thought she had to fight alone, that the weight of her past, her trauma, was something she had to carry in silence. But now, with Angelo standing beside her, something shifted. She wasn't alone. Anthony, for all his fury, was beginning to deflate under Angelo's unwavering gaze. The anger that had once held him so tightly was beginning to crack. It was clear to Sophia that Anthony, despite all his bravado, wasn't accustomed to being faced with someone like Angelo, someone whose presence commanded immediate respect. "Leave," Angelo said again, the word like a warning bell. Anthony hesitated, his posture faltering for just a moment. He glanced over his shoulder, trying to gauge Sophia's reaction. His gaze lingered on her, the weight of his disappointment and anger a silent accusation. She could see the struggle in his eyes, the need to regain the power he had once held over her. But Sophia didn't flinch this time. She didn't retreat. "We're done, Anthony," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "It's over." Her words hung in the air between them, each syllable a quiet declaration of independence. For the first time, she wasn't pleading with him. She wasn't shrinking away. She was standing her ground. The trembling in her hands subsided as she realized it. She was free. Angelo shifted slightly, a slight movement that signaled he was done with this conversation. Anthony's face twisted with anger, but there was no fire behind his eyes anymore, only the burnt-out embers of someone who could no longer hold power over what he had lost. "I'm done with you," Sophia said again, her voice gaining strength. Without another word, Anthony turned, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He stumbled away, and Angelo let the door close behind him with a soft click, sealing the past outside. Sophia stood there, her heart still racing, but now there was something else, something new, a sense of peace she had never known. Angelo's presence in her life was no longer a mystery, it was a promise. She wasn't alone. "You're safe now," Angelo said quietly, his voice smooth like velvet, but there was an unspoken command in it that made her feel like she was standing on solid ground for the first time in years. She nodded, a shaky breath escaping her lips, and in that moment she finally believed him. Sophia stood in the quiet aftermath, her hands still trembling slightly, her heart still racing from the confrontation at the door. The apartment, once a place of refuge, now felt too still, too empty. She turned away from Angelo, her gaze falling to the floor as memories began to resurface, uninvited but insistent. It was like this every time. The memories of Anthony's voice, of his hands that had once been soft with affection, now burned into her skin, leaving behind a mark far deeper than any bruise. She closed her eyes, trying to block them out, but they flooded her, a tide of images that had been pushed down for so long. She remembered the first time Anthony had called her weak, the first time he had told her she wasn't good enough. It had been subtle at first, wrapped in sweet promises and kind gestures. He had been charming, always attentive, always there when she needed him. "You're so beautiful, Sophia. No one will love you like I do." His words had been soft, loving even, but as the months passed, the compliments turned into demands. "You can't wear that. You don't want to make people think you're easy, do you?" She had chalked it up to love, or at least she convinced herself of it. After all, he said it was for her own good, that he was just trying to protect her. But it wasn't protection. It was control. It was the way he watched her every move, the way he demanded constant updates on where she was, who she was with, the way he tore down her confidence piece by piece, making her doubt herself at every turn. She remembered the nights when she had tried to escape, tried to leave him. "Where do you think you're going, Sophia? You think you're better than me?" His voice had been cold, threatening. She had begged him to understand, to let her go, but he had always found a way to reel her back in. "You know I can't live without you, Sophia." The words had twisted in her chest, suffocating her until she believed them, until she believed that without him, she was nothing. It had been years of this, years of walking on eggshells, trying to please him, trying to earn his love, but it was never enough. It was never right. She had felt trapped, locked in a cage of his making, unable to find a way out, unable to see a future beyond the suffocating weight of his control. But now, with Angelo standing beside her, something had shifted. She wasn't sure when it had started, but she knew it had. He was different from the men she had known. He didn't try to win her affection with words or empty promises. There was no charm in his demeanor, no manipulation in his gaze. He simply was, strong, unmovable, and in control of the world around him. And for the first time, Sophia felt the weight of her past begin to lift. Angelo's presence was a constant reminder that she didn't have to fight alone. When he had faced down Anthony at the door, she had felt something inside her break free, something that had been locked away for so long. It wasn't just his strength that gave her hope. It was the way he made her feel safe. Not like a prisoner, not like someone to be controlled. The weight of the past still clung to her, and she knew it would take time to heal, but for the first time in years, she felt like she had the power to take control of her own life. Angelo wasn't here to save her. He was here to stand beside her, to help her find the strength that had always been inside her. Her past was still there, lurking in the corners of her mind, but with Angelo's quiet assurance, she knew she didn't have to face it alone anymore. She wasn't trapped. Days passed in a blur of tension, each one marked by the relentless, clinging reminder of Anthony's presence. His voice on the phone, his texts, the shadows of him still lingering at the edges of her life. But despite the weight of it all, there was a new rhythm now, a steady pulse that Sophia hadn't realized she had been missing until it arrived. Angelo's presence in her life was quiet, unassuming, but it was constant, like a shadow that followed her, not out of fear, but out of assurance. He didn't overwhelm her. Instead, he simply existed, as though he were a permanent fixture in the landscape of her life. She had expected his help to be one grand gesture, something dramatic, but instead, Angelo's care was shown in small, deliberate actions. It was in the way he asked her if she was all right when they crossed paths in the hallway, or how he made sure her locks were changed, her windows reinforced. He had arranged for a security system to be installed in her apartment, complete with motion sensors and cameras, yet he never once pushed her to engage with it. It was always there, just in case, quietly protecting her from the unseen threats. She'd always thought protection was loud, forceful, a show of power meant to intimidate. But Angelo's was different. His protection was passive, his security was unspoken, and his strength was constant, yet understated. Each time she saw him, there was no urgency in his demeanor, no rushing. He simply did what needed to be done, without a hint of concern or stress in his movements. He made sure she was safe, and in doing so, he showed her what it meant to be cared for without fear, without strings attached. Sophia had always been used to the chaos. She had been used to the storms of Anthony's anger, the wild, unpredictable nature of his outbursts. But with Angelo, the silence was comforting. He was the calm in her storm, the steady presence that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, the world outside wasn't as dangerous as it had seemed. She could breathe again without feeling like someone was about to pull the rug from under her at any given moment. It wasn't just the security measures or his quiet protection. It was in the way he made decisions without hesitation, the way he knew exactly what to do when Anthony's threats grew louder, when the situation seemed to escalate. "You won't be alone," Angelo had said that night after Anthony had pounded on her door again. It had been a simple statement, but one that had stuck with her, nestled in the back of her mind. She had never felt truly safe before, not in the way he made her feel. Sophia had always been independent, had prided herself on being able to handle things on her own. But somewhere along the way, she had forgotten how to trust, how to lean on someone else. Angelo never asked her to depend on him. He simply made her feel like she could. His presence didn't diminish her. It lifted her. In the weeks that followed, she began to realize that maybe stability wasn't just something you created for yourself. It was something you could build together. With Angelo by her side, she wasn't looking over her shoulder anymore. She wasn't constantly bracing for the next emotional blow. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to be just her, no longer a victim, no longer afraid. And in that newfound clarity, she saw him for what he truly was, more than just a protector. Angelo was a stabilizing force, a man who offered her the kind of strength that didn't have to be shouted from the rooftops. It was steady, it was enduring, and it was the foundation she had been searching for. The days had grown heavier. Each morning, Sophia would wake to the familiar weight of unease pressing against her chest, the nagging uncertainty that lingered just beneath the surface. Anthony hadn't stopped. His calls were frequent, his messages increasingly threatening, each one carrying the weight of his desperation. He was getting bolder, more volatile, his attempts to reinsert himself into her life feeling less like threats and more like promises. Promises of the kind of torment that never really left, the kind that wrapped itself around her soul, squeezing until she could hardly breathe. Angelo could sense it, the shift in the air, the crackle of something dark building outside her door. He didn't show it, though. He never showed it. His presence was as constant as the rising sun, a reassuring force that remained unfazed by the storms outside. But he wasn't blind to the tension. He knew what was coming, and he knew how to handle it. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the apartment, Anthony appeared again. This time, he wasn't pounding on the door. This time, he was at the building entrance, pacing back and forth, his breath heavy with anger. He had been watching her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She could feel his eyes on her, even as she walked to the window, glancing down at the scene unfolding below. His anger was palpable, simmering in every movement, every clench of his fists. Angelo stood beside her, his eyes scanning the situation with practiced calm. He didn't need to ask her what was going on. He already knew. "Stay here," he said softly, his voice steady, like the calm before a storm. Sophia's heart thudded in her chest, but there was no fear in her this time, not in the way there had been before. Angelo's voice, his presence, had become the antidote to the poison of her past. She didn't move, just watched him as he crossed the room toward the door with the same quiet confidence he carried with him always. When Angelo opened the door, there was no hesitation, no moment of negotiation. He simply stepped outside, closing it softly behind him. The sound of the door clicking shut seemed to mark a boundary, one that Anthony could no longer cross. Anthony's eyes narrowed when he saw Angelo, the fury still evident on his face, but now there was something else there, uncertainty. The man who had once controlled every aspect of her life was suddenly unsure. "What the hell is this?" Anthony snarled, his voice thick with venom. Angelo didn't answer immediately. He simply stood, his posture unmoving, his eyes cool as ice. There was no need for words, no need for bravado. Angelo knew that power wasn't something you had to shout about. It was something you held without question, and the moment Anthony stepped toward him, trying to push past, trying to reclaim the space he thought was his, Angelo was already there, blocking him with ease. "You need to leave," Angelo said, his voice low but unwavering. Anthony laughed, a bitter, jagged sound that filled the air between them. "You think you can stop me? After everything I've done?" Angelo didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood his ground. There was a stillness about him that made Anthony pause, made him reconsider his approach. "You've done nothing," Angelo replied, his voice barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of an unspoken threat. "You've lost, and you'll keep losing if you keep pushing." The words hung in the air, sharp and final. The edge in Angelo's voice was enough to make Anthony hesitate, his earlier bravado evaporating as the reality of the situation settled in. The intensity of the moment stretched on, but it was clear. Anthony looked at Angelo for one last time, and for the first time since Sophia had known him, he didn't look like he was in control. "I'll be back," he muttered, the words thick with frustration, but Angelo didn't respond. The door clicked shut behind him, and Angelo stood there for a moment longer, his back to Sophia. He didn't need to say anything. His presence was enough. The tension outside, the danger, the fear that had plagued her for so long, it all began to melt away. She wasn't alone, and Anthony had finally been put in his place. The evening settled around them like a soft, heavy blanket, the kind that wrapped you up and offered a strange kind of comfort, even in the stillness. Sophia sat on the edge of the couch, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass, the warmth of the tea soothing the tension in her body. Angelo had been quiet for a while, his presence so steady, so constant, that she had almost forgotten the storm that had raged outside only hours before. They had spent the past few days in a strange kind of peace, one that felt almost fragile. Angelo had kept his distance, not because he didn't care, but because he understood something she hadn't realized she needed. Space. Space to breathe, space to heal. But now, as the night stretched on and the apartment grew darker, a question lingered in the air between them. "Why are you helping me?" Her voice was soft, tentative, as though she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to hear the answer. Angelo had been nothing but calm, protective, and resolute since the moment he stepped into her life, but she had yet to understand what motivated him. It wasn't just the security system, the quiet steps he took to ensure her safety. It was his unwavering presence. It was like he saw something in her that she couldn't see herself, something that was worth protecting. Angelo didn't answer immediately. He took a slow breath, his gaze fixed on the dark window, as though the world outside held more answers than he was willing to give. "You've been through more than anyone should," he finally said, his voice a low rumble, barely above a whisper. "I can see it in you, the way you carry it, even when you try to hide it. But you fought, Sophia, and that means something." Sophia's heart stuttered in her chest, the truth of his words hitting harder than she expected. "What do you mean, fought?" she asked, her voice barely a murmur. She had always thought of herself as weak, as someone who had been pushed down, broken, controlled. But Angelo saw something different in her. He leaned forward, his expression steady but heavy with something unspoken. "I know what it's like to be trapped, to feel like there's no way out. I've been there." Her breath caught in her throat. The words felt like a lifeline, but also a thread she wasn't sure she wanted to pull. "What do you mean?" She pressed again, her curiosity outweighing her caution. Angelo hesitated, as if debating whether to share this part of himself with her. Finally, he spoke, his voice even but laden with a quiet, weighty honesty. "I wasn't always this man, you see. I grew up in a world where survival was everything. My father was a part of the underworld, a man whose empire was built on fear. I did what I had to do to survive. I learned early on that people don't protect you unless they want something in return. But I wanted out. I wanted something better." Sophia sat quietly, absorbing his words, her heart aching as she realized that, in some ways, they weren't so different. She had fought too, just in a different battle, one that had felt impossible to escape. The weight of her past had always been with her, but hearing Angelo's story, his own fight for freedom, for something better, gave her a new perspective. "I walked away from that life," he continued, his eyes darkening. "It wasn't easy, and it came with its own price. But I chose a different path, one where I could live without looking over my shoulder. I wanted to make something real, something that wouldn't haunt me." Sophia swallowed hard, the pain of her own past mingling with the understanding that she wasn't alone in her struggles. Angelo had chosen to leave his darkness behind, just as she was trying to do. And somehow she realized they had both chosen to move forward, not just for survival, but for something better. "I see you, Sophia," Angelo said, his voice quiet but fierce. "And I won't let you be defined by your past. It doesn't own you. You're stronger than you know." The weight of his words settled in her chest, and for the first time in a long while, Sophia felt a crack in the armor she had built around herself. She wasn't alone anymore, and maybe, just maybe, her future didn't have to be a mirror of her past. For the first time in a long time, she believed it. She believed in herself. The air was thick with anticipation as Sophia stood by the window, her eyes fixed on the street below. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the city bathed in a cold, pale light. She could feel the tension building, a weight that had been steadily increasing since Angelo had made it clear that tonight was the night. Anthony would come, and this time it would be different. The relentless pressure she had felt for so long, the fear, the helplessness, the constant sense of being pursued, had been building to this moment. And though her hands were trembling, though her pulse quickened in her veins, there was something else inside her now, something she hadn't recognized before. Strength. A deep-rooted, quiet power that had slowly, steadily been growing ever since Angelo had come into her life. Tonight, it would surface, and it would be enough. Behind her, Angelo stood still, his presence so commanding it felt like he filled the room without moving an inch. His gaze was fixed on her, and though his expression remained unreadable, there was a sense of calm certainty about him, the kind of certainty that came from knowing exactly who you were and what you stood for. "I'm not afraid anymore," she whispered, though the words barely escaped her lips. Angelo didn't respond with words. Instead, he took a step forward and placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm but not demanding. It was the kind of reassurance that went beyond words, a promise of protection and partnership. Then, the doorbell rang, its sound sharp and unsettling. Sophia's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't flinch. She didn't retreat. This was her moment, her chance to face the past and finally take control. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the years she had spent in fear begin to melt away. Angelo moved first, stepping toward the door with deliberate steps. His actions were calm, methodical, as though this moment was as routine as any other. But there was power in his every movement, an authority that spoke volumes without a single word. He opened the door, and there he was. Anthony. But the man standing there now wasn't the same one who had once controlled her life. His eyes were wild, filled with frustration and anger, but there was something else. A flicker of fear. Fear of the man standing next to her. Fear of the power that had shifted. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Anthony's voice came out in a snarl, his fists clenched at his sides. "I'm stopping you," Angelo replied quietly, his voice calm but cutting. Anthony's gaze darted between the two of them, and for the first time he hesitated. He looked at Sophia, his eyes filled with rage, but also something else. Disbelief. He couldn't comprehend it. She wasn't cowering. She wasn't shrinking. "You're nothing without me, Sophia. You know that." His words were venomous, trying to claw his way back into her life. But Sophia stood tall now, a strength emanating from her that Anthony couldn't understand. "I don't need you anymore." Her voice was steady, unwavering. She stepped closer to Angelo, her presence no longer defined by fear, but by her own resolve. She was no longer the woman who had been controlled, manipulated, and broken. She was the woman who had survived, the woman who had fought to stand tall, and now, with Angelo by her side, she would never fall again. Angelo didn't move, his gaze still locked on Anthony. "Leave. Now." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had come before and everything that was to come after. Anthony's fists loosened, his bravado slipping away. He stepped back, his shoulders sagging under the weight of defeat. He looked at Sophia one last time, but this time the woman in front of him wasn't the same. She wasn't a victim anymore. Without a word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Sophia stood there, her heart racing, but for the first time in years, she felt the fear fade completely. Angelo's presence, his calm, unshakable strength, had made all the difference. And as she looked at him, standing beside her, she realized that the world had shifted. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living, and in that moment, the future had never seemed more possible. The days after the confrontation with Anthony felt different. The tension that had once hung thick in the air seemed to dissipate, leaving a strange calm in its wake. Sophia couldn't quite pinpoint when the change had begun, but she felt it in her bones, in the way she carried herself, in the way she no longer flinched at the sound of the doorbell or the unexpected rustling of the wind against the window. For the first time in years, she wasn't looking over her shoulder, waiting for the next storm to hit. She had spent so much time running from her past, hiding in the shadows of fear and self-doubt, convinced that the things Anthony had said about her were true, that she was weak, that she wasn't worth protecting. But now, as the sun filtered through the curtains of her apartment and bathed the room in warm light, she realized how much she had been holding back, how much of her own strength had been buried under the weight of everything she had endured. She was standing in her kitchen, her hands moving absent-mindedly over the dishes, when she caught sight of herself in the window. It was the first time she had really looked at herself in days, and for a moment she didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. She had always seen herself as fragile, like glass, delicate and prone to breaking, but the woman in the reflection was different. She was standing tall, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted just slightly, as though she had finally found her place in the world. For so long, she had let fear define her, let it rule her every action, every choice. But now, it was different. She could feel the quiet, steady strength growing within her. She was no longer the person who hid from the shadows of her past. She was learning to face them head-on. Sophia closed her eyes, letting the moment settle over her. She thought of all the times she had apologized for simply existing, for taking up space, for daring to want more than what Anthony had allowed her. She thought of the nights she had spent awake, too scared to sleep, wondering if she would ever be free. And yet, here she was. When she opened her eyes, it was as though the world had shifted just slightly. There was a quiet confidence in her now, a certainty that had never existed before. It wasn't loud or brash, it was just there, solid and real. She turned away from the window, walking toward the small table in the corner of the room. She hadn't been able to focus on anything for so long. Work, her relationships, her own well-being. But now, as she sat down and began to sort through the pile of papers on the table, she realized she wasn't doing it out of obligation. She was doing it because she could, because she wanted to. There was still a long road ahead. Her past wasn't something she could simply erase, and there would be days when the shadows would creep back in. But for the first time, she understood that she had the strength to face them. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. Sophia picked up her phone, her fingers moving with newfound purpose as she dialed the number for the counselor she had been too afraid to call all those months ago. As the phone rang, she felt a sense of quiet victory settle inside her. This was the first step toward building the life she had always wanted but had never believed was possible. And this time, she wasn't doing it alone. The first morning after everything had settled felt like a rebirth. The soft light of dawn crept through the window, spilling across the room in golden streaks that seemed to cleanse the space of all the shadows that had once haunted it. Sophia sat on the edge of her bed, her fingers tracing the fabric of the comforter beneath her, feeling the quiet hum of peace that was settling into her life. It was a feeling she had never known. Not truly, for the first time. There was no tightness in her chest, no restless unease that clawed at her from the inside. She was still, she was present. Her apartment, once a prison, now felt like a sanctuary. The walls that had once seemed too close, too confining, now felt like a safe space, a place where she could breathe without fear. She could look around and see it for what it was. Hers. And she was the one who had created it. The thought made her smile. Small but genuine. She stood up slowly, her body moving with a new kind of fluidity, as if the weight of the past had been lifted just enough for her to feel free. She walked over to the window, pulling the blinds aside to let the full light of the morning in. She didn't feel the old anxiety that would have come with such a simple act. No need to check the locks, no need to look over her shoulder. It was just her now, and the world outside was waiting for her to take the next step. Sophia had spent so long defining herself by what she had endured, by the darkness that had clung to her. But now, she was learning to see herself in a new light. She wasn't just the survivor of her past, she was the creator of her future. As she stood there, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin, a soft knock came at the door. It was a familiar sound now, one that no longer made her heart race with fear. She opened it to find Angelo standing there, his expression unreadable as always, but there was something in his eyes today. Something softer, something that told her he saw her, really saw her. He wasn't just the man who had saved her. He was the one who had stood beside her as she found her own strength. He wasn't her savior. He was her partner. "I was wondering if you were up," he said, his voice warm but steady as it always was. "I am now," Sophia replied, a playful smile tugging at her lips. They stood there for a moment, the quiet between them comfortable, filled with the kind of unspoken understanding that only came from time spent together, from battles fought and won side by side. "I've been thinking," Sophia said, her voice stronger than it had been even a week ago. "I think it's time for me to take control of the next step. No more fear. No more holding back." Angelo didn't say anything, just gave her a nod of approval. He wasn't here to make decisions for her or to step in and take charge. He was here because he believed in her. He always had. Sophia smiled and stepped out of the doorway, fully ready to embrace the life waiting for her. Angelo fell into step beside her, his presence a steady rhythm, but it was her feet that moved first. She wasn't looking for someone to lead her anymore. She was walking her own path now, and no one, not even her past, could stop her. As they walked into the future together, side by side, Sophia knew one thing for sure. She was her own hero now, and the world had never seemed more open.